So in the early 20th century, avant-garde or bohemian artists really continued to rebel against both social and artistic conventions by responding to the economic, social, and technological changes of the world around them, and by continuing to kind of experiment with formal elements like color, form, style, etc. Modernist art is often subversive in both style and intent, and it tends to be visually, socially, and politically radical. The developing idea of the modern artist as this special individual, which was usually a white male, and they were thought to be sort of heroically committed to artistic freedom, and this kind of meant that stylistic originality and individuality became markers of artistic genius and significance. Now, many different movements developed in the early 20th century, each with distinct labels, and several of them with their own manifestos or statements of intent. And so sometimes this period of the early 20th century is referred to as an age or an era of isms. So Fauvism, which lasted from maybe about 1905 to 1908, developed in France as the first new artistic style of the 20th century. So in about 1903, a group of avant-garde artists they organized and founded the Salon des Automnes, or the Autumn Salon, separate from the official academic salon that was held every spring. And they intended this exhibition to provide a platform for progressive modernist artists. Several major modernist movements made their debuts here. In 1905, a group of paintings by artists André Derain, Henri Matisse, and a few others, featuring vivid, unreal colors, simplified forms, and energetic brushwork, were included. And they were displayed in the same room with a sculpture by another artist that was done in a more traditional Renaissance style. An art critic in attendance, Louis Vassel, he later described this juxtaposition, writing "Un Donatello parmi les fauves," or a Donatello among the wild beasts. For Vassel, the wildness lay in the, quote, orgy of pure colors, and also in the aggressive execution of the paintings, which he found savage and incoherent, and ultimately the name Les Fauves stuck. Les Fauves, as they became known, they were somewhat a disparate group. They were never really truly unified in style, and the movement was pretty short-lived, with Derain, Matisse, and the others going their separate ways by about 1908. But they were extremely influential in terms of style and intensity. The Fauves were undeniably building on Impressionist and post-Impressionist traditions, experimenting with color and bold brushwork, and really exploring the expressive effects of these elements. But they were even bolder in their approach, engaging in ever wilder painterly experiments intended to release color from its descriptive function and allowing it to act as a force in its own right. So these two canvases by André Derain, Mountains at Coeur and The Pool of London, these really sort of exemplify the Fauvist movement. So in each, he's applied short, broad strokes of pure, very highly saturated colors. And he's often placing complements like blue and orange or red and green directly next to each other to really intensify the hues of each other. Remember, we talked about simultaneous contrast when we were looking at Seurat and Pointillism. Notice especially how here on the left, how the mountains, he's kind of relying on that optical effect of warm and cool colors, how warm colors appear to sort of advance in space and cool colors appear to recede. And so he's really sort of building the illusion of volume and depth within the mountain range here. He uses a range of semi-naturalistic colors. I mean, we have green for the grass and the leaves, a sort of reddish-brown for the tree trunks. We have blue tones in the water here. But the uniform, bright tone of the colors really sort of minimizes any illusion of atmospheric perspective and distorts the sense of space, compressing or flattening the composition. Also notice how Derain, especially in the canvas on the left, he's really left some areas of the canvas unpainted, and he's done that on purpose. He's allowing the white of the canvas to sort of show through. So he tends to create these recognizable landscape scenes, but he also creates this sense of tension between an illusionistic image and the two-dimensional reality of the painting. Viewers are totally aware that these are flat canvases covered in paint rather than windows into reality. This tension, along with the vivid colors and vigorous brushstrokes, really infuses Derain's works with this dynamic visual energy. He once described his colors as, quote, sticks of dynamite, and his stark juxtapositions of complements as, quote, deliberate disharmonies. So the oldest member of the Fauves was Henri Matisse. Matisse had practiced law prior to his long, varied career as an artist. His early works are more naturalistic, though rather heavily influenced by Impressionism, and then he spent some time experimenting with Pointillism, but he really made his mark as a Fauve. Like Derain, Matisse wanted to use color imaginatively, and he was equally interested in this idea of deliberate disharmonies. The work here on the left, Woman with a Hat, this was included in that 1905 Autumn Salon, and it was quite controversial because of the thick swatches of crude, seemingly arbitrary, non-naturalistic color, and the broad, blunt brushwork. So the subject here, in both actually, is Matisse's wife, and she actually worked as a hat maker and she sold women's hats. And so she probably made and sold the type of hat that she's shown wearing here. Her face is depicted with this bold sort of green stroke across her brow and then another sort of down the edge of the nose. And then we also have this bluish green rectangle kind of below her lower lip between her mouth and her chin. Now, again, this on the right is also another portrait of Madame Matisse, although it's usually referred to as the green stripe or the green line. And that's because we have this rather distinctive green band that kind of divides her face in half, creating a rather striking graphic composition. Now, Matisse did not seek to paint what he saw as accurately as possible, and he wasn't really concerned with creating a recognizable or naturalistic portrait of his wife, nor did he intend to create a psychological portrait or a commentary on their relationship. Instead, he was simply seeking to convey an inner experience and to create a dynamic visual experience for viewers that would really draw them into the work. In fact, once, in response to someone who said that his work did not look like an actual woman, Matisse allegedly said, quote, "I did not create a woman, I made a picture." Now again, in both of these, Matisse kind of intentionally contrasts blocks of color. We'll look more specifically at the green line here. Notice how that green line really divides the face into two halves. We've got a sort of warmer and then a cooler half. And so that really sort of contributes to this flat, geometric or planar effect that makes the portrait abstracted and seem almost maybe like a mask. Now, there are no traditional shadows or shading on Madame Matisse, but the green stripe, really in both, the green here and then the green here as well, that sort of mimics the effects of light and shadow and adds dimension to the face. So Matisse believed that art should evoke a specific mood or emotion using color alone. And I think that's something that's evident in this 1906 work titled The Joy of Life. Now this is a large-scale work, about 5 foot 8 inches by 7 foot 9 inches, and it depicts a rather conventional subject. He's referencing Renaissance and mythological themes here, with a pastoral landscape filled with brilliantly colored forest, meadow, sea, and sky, and populated by nude figures both at rest and in motion. But like with Cézanne's Large Bathers, which was painted at the same time, or during the same year, Matisse approaches this familiar subject in a rather avant-garde way. As with his earlier fauve canvases, color is responsive here only to emotional expression and the formal needs of the canvas, but not to the realities of nature. Additionally, he's drawing on folk art traditions in his use of bold outlines, unmodeled forms, distorted proportions and perspectives, and flattened forms and spaces. Matisse has structured his composition so that the landscape functions as a stage, and we have sort of these groups of trees on either side that sort of serve as curtains that have been spread apart to highlight the lively interactions below. His vivid colors and the repetition of curvilinear lines in both the trees and then the contours of the figures' bodies really serve to unify them with the landscape. Notice, too, that he doesn't depict forms that recede into the background and diminish in scale. If you study the figures in the foreground and the middle ground, you'll see that the scale is rather badly skewed. And the shift of scale between, say, this lounging flute player and then the smooching couple kind of right next to them here, that's perhaps plausible if we consider the flute player to be maybe a child. But then we have these rather giant figures kind of directly behind them. And so compared to the figures standing in the wings, these central figures are absolutely enormous, way out of proportion. But again, Matisse is not attempting to create an accurate representation of reality, but rather a fantastical paradise and an expression of pure pleasure. Of this work, he wrote, quote, "The whole arrangement of my picture is expressive. The place occupied by figures or objects, the empty spaces around them, the proportions, everything plays a part, and the chief aim of color should be to serve expression as well as possible." Now, in the grand scheme of his long career, Matisse's Fauve period was rather brief, but the highly saturated colors, simple flowing lines, flattened pictorial spaces, limited details, and the expressive nature of his Fauve works was incredibly influential, not only for his own future work, but for that of modernists everywhere. In his 1908 book, which he called Notes of a Painter, he wrote, quote, "What I dream of is an art of balance, purity, and serenity, devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter, an art which might be, for every mental worker, something like a good armchair in which to rest from physical fatigue." So perhaps the most prominent of the modern art isms that developed in this early 20th century period is Cubism. But because Cubism is so indebted to the formal experiments and ideas of Pablo Picasso, we really need to talk about him and his early career a bit before we can discuss true Cubism. So, Pablo Picasso, he was born in 1881 in Malaga, Spain, and really he was an artistic child prodigy, producing highly polished academic works like this, The Old Fisherman, when he was just 13 or 14 years old. Now, this canvas is really nothing like the later works, which he is quite famous for, but consider, he was born in 1881, and so by 13 or 14, he's already really mastered the conventional painting techniques and styles, and so then he lives until 1973. That's an incredibly long career. So if you're painting this at age 14, imagine what you would be doing in your 20s, your 40s, or maybe even your 60s. And that's really how Picasso's career sort of develops here. Picasso's first mature works really have symbolist leanings. Between about 1901 and 1904, during his early 20s, Picasso was hopping back and forth between his native Spain and Paris, the hub of avant-garde artistic activity, where he was drawn to the work of Cézanne as well as to other modern trends. Now, during this time, he was relatively poor, rather disillusioned with modern capitalist society, and quite depressed, especially after a close friend of his, committed suicide in 1901. And so art historians often refer to this period between 1901 and 1904 as Picasso's blue period, because his works tend to use this cold, monochromatic blue palette to sort of depict brooding scenes of marginalized, disabled, and oppressed members of society, and themes of poverty, loneliness, and despair. So this 1903 work titled La Vie is exemplary of this period, with its moody, cold color palette suggestive of night, mystery, dreams, and death. It depicts four figures. We have to the left a young, mostly nude couple, and then to the right an older woman holding an infant. The ambiguous subject matter here has been interpreted variously. Sometimes it's considered to be a tribute to his recently deceased friend and the life that he would never get to have, but it's also been interpreted as an allegory of sacred and profane love, a symbolic representation of the cycles of life, and a working class couple facing the hazards of reality. Then, in 1904, Picasso settled permanently in Paris, and he joined a larger group of avant-gardes. Between 1904 and 1906, in what art historians refer to as Picasso's Rose period, he lightened his color palette, enlivening it with rose tones of warm pink, red, and orange. He also became fascinated with saltimbanques, or traveling carnival performers like acrobats and harlequins. He rarely painted them, however, during their performances. Instead, he chose to depict the often harsh reality of their lives off stage and show how they lived sort of on the margins of society, but really he depicts these scenes in a rather light, graceful way. His 1905 work seen here, Family of Saltimbanques, he depicts 6 off-duty performers in a sort of weary silence. The composition itself is rather asymmetrically balanced, with this group of 5 figures huddled closely together on the left, and then a single female figure here sort of strangely isolated to the right. Now, despite the close proximity of everyone in the picture plane, the Stoic figures seem to be rather detached, and they seem as empty as the landscape that they occupy. There's a certain sense of melancholy here, but also maybe of meditative contemplation. Additionally, the harlequin figure in this sort of checkered costume is commonly interpreted as a self-portrait of the artist, and that maybe would reflect that Picasso really identified with these individuals as young, impoverished, again, often marginalized and transient artists who were striving for success and for recognition. So in 1907, Picasso radically broke with academic conventions to create one of the most complex paintings of the 20th century, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or the Young Ladies of Avignon. Now, some argue that Picasso made this large-scale canvas, which is nearly 8 feet square, to compete with both Cézanne's Large Bathers and Matisse's Joy of Life, which they were both created kind of just before Picasso's work here. And so like both Cézanne and Matisse, he sort of adapted this traditional subject of nude female figures, although with his title, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he's kind of modernizing the subject along the lines of Edward Manet. Demoiselle was a common euphemism for prostitute at this time, and Avignon was the name of a street in the red light district of Barcelona. So Picasso's female figures here, they're not meant to be mythological beauties, but modern prostitutes. Now, in terms of style, he really admired Cézanne's constructivist approach, and he sought to kind of break forms down into very simplified geometric planes. But in this case, it also seems that he's potentially exploring Matisse's expressive approach to color. This work, however, was also largely informed by ancient and non-Western artistic traditions. In 1906, the Louvre in Paris installed a new collection of ancient sculpture from the Iberian Peninsula, which is present-day Spain and Portugal. These sculptures dated to maybe about the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, and Picasso found these quite interesting, but he was even more interested in the indigenous arts of European colonies in Indonesia, Oceania, and sub-Saharan Africa, and he saw several displays of these works in the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadero, the ethnographic museum in Paris, which opened in 1878. So the term primitivism refers to the widespread tendency of modern artists in Europe to delve into quote-unquote non-Western artistic traditions for inspiration. However, it's a little bit more complicated than just that. Primitivism reflects the tendency of early modern Europe to ascribe naive or negative beliefs and behaviors, such as extreme purity or spiritual fervor, unbridled passion, or maybe unrestrained sexuality and violence. They ascribe these things to peoples of unindustrialized societies, characterizing them as quote-unquote primitives that exist at an earlier stage of human development. It supports the constructed belief that Western culture is more civilized, more developed, and more complex than other unindustrialized cultures. It also supports the false narrative that the West is this ideal civilization unified by race, culture, and progress toward the same mythical norm of modernity. In the same way that European colonial powers exploited these primitive lands for raw materials and labor to increase their own wealth and power, so did Western modern artists exploit the visual cultures of primitive nations to amplify ideas about themselves. Europeans, in a lot of ways, were feeling nostalgia for the pre-industrial times when humanity lived closer in harmony with both natural and spiritual realms. And in these, again, primitive cultures, they saw a more direct, authentic expression of instinctual creativity. However, Europeans also generally defined indigenous arts by Western ideas rather than by their own contexts and functions. They wrongly assumed arts of primitive cultures were not dynamic or changing over time, but were timeless or frozen at an earlier stage of a supposed common scale of human development. Primitivism in art really involves the appreciation and imitation of cultural products and practices that are perceived to be primitive. And so this definition contains a basic contradiction. The primitive is both admired and even seen as a model, but at the same time, it is also presumed to be inferior because it's not fully developed. And so this paradox makes primitivism a concept that is both intellectually and morally complex. Many early modern artists in Europe represented other cultures and appropriated aspects of their art without understanding or caring to understand how those cultures actually functioned or how their art was actually used. And that is the case for Pablo Picasso. He was especially drawn to what he described as the, quote, expressive power and formal strangeness of African masks. He purchased several pieces of African art, including masks and other sculptures, and kept them in his studio. And he was really one of the first artists in Paris to use African imagery and techniques in his paintings. In Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he's appropriated African imagery and methods of abstraction, and combined those with references to ancient Iberian sculpture as well as other modern European art, resulting in an unsettling composition with forms that are neither conventionally European or authentically African. So Picasso arranges his 5 radically simplified female figures horizontally across the composition here. The central 2, they stand rather frontally, kind of displaying themselves to the viewer in these abstracted variations of the traditional contrapposto pose, with arms raised above their heads. But they directly contradict this sort of accessibility with rather hard, piercing gazes and tight mouths. The figure to the left here is in rigid profile with this striding stance, which perhaps recalls ancient Greek funerary statues. The seated or crouched figure over here to the right maybe could recall the seated nude in Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, and therefore the seated nude in Raimondi's print after Raphael's Judgment of Paris. Now, the 3 leftmost figures, they have rather flattened features, especially in the face. They have rather large, wide, almond-shaped eyes with heavy eyelids, and so their faces or their heads kind of recall the ancient Iberian stone sculptures that Picasso would have seen in the Louvre. But then the 2 figures on the right here, with their sort of long, sharp noses, their really small mouths, and their almond-shaped eyes, and kind of the geometric planes of the face, these seem to emulate African masks. Now, additionally, Picasso follows Cézanne by experimenting with perspective and showing things simultaneously from multiple points of view. For example, notice how this seated or crouching figure is kind of turned. We see her torso from the back, but also from sort of this 3/4 view at the same time. And yet her head is sort of turned completely around on her neck like an owl, so we see her face frontally. Picasso also further distorts the composition by flattening and fragmenting both the figures and the negative space around them into sharp, angular forms that overlap, creating this ambiguous, incoherent sense of space. In many ways, it sort of seems that Picasso is challenging the depiction of the nude female figure in Western art history. Like Edward Manet, he presents contemporary prostitutes rather than mythological goddesses, but he seemingly takes things a step further, contradicting their objectification and consumption with hard angularity and ferocity. The art historian Leo Steinberg has described this work as a, quote, tidal wave of female aggression, in response to the implication that these women are not the passive, gentle, ownable creatures that men desired them to be. Maybe Picasso intended this as some sort of social commentary about women's roles, or perhaps Picasso was responding to that expressive intensity that he saw in the African masks. The two figures to the right, which seem more aggressive in stance than those to the left, could perhaps be interpreted as some sort of commentary about quote-unquote primitive versus civilized cultures. I think more than anything, though, Picasso was experimenting formally and deliberately trying to break with Western artistic traditions. To do so, he's chosen a rather familiar, long-standing subject of the female nude. And at least since the Renaissance, that subject has been used to portray sexual availability, but through radical formal or visual experimentation, he's not only shattering existing stylistic conventions, but he's also contradicting that existing interpretation or the significance of the subject matter. Now, most of Picasso's friends were quite shocked by this work, including Henri Matisse, who even threatened to break off their friendship and accused Picasso of mocking modern art. However, another artist, Georges Braque, was so greatly inspired by the work that he really embraced Picasso's radical ideas and ultimately collaborated with him to develop Cubism. So in a lot of ways, this work by Picasso is a precursor to Cubism, but keep in mind that the vivid or bright colors here, along with the recognizable forms and the rather intense emotional charge, are going to be quite different than what we'll see in true Cubism. So Georges Braque was born in Le Havre, France, where he trained as a decorator before moving to Paris in 1900, where he painted brightly colored Fauvist landscapes like this. After he attended the 1906 retrospective exhibition of Cézanne's works, and after he saw Picasso's 1907 Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Braque became increasingly interested in flattening pictorial spaces, in multiple perspectives, and in simplified geometric forms. During the summer of 1908, he studied Cézanne closely, revisiting his old haunts and recreating some of his compositions, but further reducing them to their most essential colors and basic geometric shapes. So for example, here we have Braque's Houses at Lestock, and it depicts the same town as Cézanne's canvas here, and from this sort of similar elevated perspective. However, he's taken Cézanne's multifaceted plein air constructions a step further, really piling these flat, angular shapes into this shallow, unrealistic space. The critic Louis Vaucel mocked Braque's composition, saying that he had, quote, reduced everything to cubes. And so ultimately, this kind of mocking kind of birthed the art historical label of Cubism. So in about 1907 or 1908, Braque and Picasso began this very close working relationship. They practiced flattening pictorial space, incorporating multiple perspectives, and fracturing forms down to their most basic geometric planes. This collaboration lasted until 1914, and of this time, Braque wrote, quote, "We were like two mountain climbers roped together." Now, art historians generally divide Picasso and Braque's Cubist works into two categories. Now, I'm not going to ask you to differentiate between those two categories on a test or an assignment, but I did want to sort of explain them just a little bit to show how these Cubist ideas really develop over time. So the works that Braque and Picasso created between about 1907 and 1911 are typically known as analytic cubism because the artists seem to break apart objects and spaces as if to analyze the individual pieces. These earlier works reduce forms to semi-abstracted interconnecting planes, and they tend to use rather subdued colors, almost a monochromatic palette in a lot of cases, and they tend to present rather neutral subject matter, such as still lifes or sometimes portraiture, but in a very unrecognizable way. The deconstructed and reassembled forms are not reassembled according to the laws of nature or the processes of perception, but rather in accordance with the principles of artistic composition to communicate meaning rather than to represent observed reality. So, for example, this work by Braque, Violin and Palette, from about 1909 or 1910, kind of exemplifies this analytic cubism, or this abstraction of recognizable subjects and spaces. He presents a violin, some sheet music, and an artist's palette, but he flattens and fragments these recognizable forms and the space around them to really facilitate their integration into the compositional whole. And so he creates this sort of singular, almost monochromatic layer of shifting interconnected planes. And there are just a few areas where we can sort of make out the remnants of those recognizable objects. Picasso and Braque also turned to human subjects for the basis of their formal experimentations. So on the left here we have Picasso's 1910 portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, which depicts the artist's first and most important art dealer in Paris, who was a prominent supporter of both Cubism and modern art in general. It's somewhat difficult to read this as a portrait, though, because Picasso has really broken up the figure and his face into, again, flat, planar components, and then he's rearranged them in the composition to sort of show multiple perspectives, as if the subject, the artist, and or the viewer are moving. This is something that Picasso called simultaneous vision. In a lot of ways, analytic cubism functions to mimic the process of seeing, in which we examine something from various perspectives or viewpoints, and then reconstruct those fragments or pieces within our mind to form a whole. Because of his rearrangement, the fragments here don't quite add up to a whole person, but instead he's sort of declared the human presence to be secondary to the formal requirements of the concept. Similarly, Braque's The Portuguese is a portrait of a musician playing on a dock outside a cafe or a bar, yet the fragmented forms within the composition represent only small parts of the scene, and they really don't add up to a whole person, an instrument, or any other elements. We can make out a few things, such as maybe this trace of a nose, a mustache, and maybe eyelashes. We can also make out the body and maybe the strings of the guitar that he's playing here. And then in the upper left, the upper right, we have this sort of cylindrical form with what appears to be kind of this rope-like form wrapped around it. So this is really meant to represent a nautical rope wrapped around the wooden post of the dock that the musician is playing on. We also have stenciled letters and numbers, B-A-L, and then we have a couple more letters over here, some numbers. These are meant to reference the bill that you would receive from the cafe or the bar, and also they are inherently flat elements, and so they emphasize the flatness of the painted surface and remind the viewer that the painting is an object rather than a window into reality. Again, it's difficult to separate forms from backgrounds here because everything is really broken into flat overlapping shards of various levels of transparency, all layered with webs of lines and unfinished contours. Works like Picasso's Ma Jolie from 1911 or 1912 really brought the pair to the brink of total abstraction. The subject matter here was a female figure with a stringed instrument, and again, remnants of the forms remain. We can see parts of her head, her shoulders, the contours of her body, her hand, but it's really nearly impossible to reconstruct them into a recognizable figure. The phrase "ma jolie" means "my pretty one," which was a nickname that Picasso used for his lover at the time, so perhaps the female figure was meant to be her. But the title was also that of a popular song at this time, so the inclusion of the instrument, the writing, and the musical notes sort of suggests maybe a reference to that song or a totally different meaning. Regardless, the subject matter here is really secondary to the formal abstraction yet again. The composition consists of rather delicately patterned grays and browns that create the illusion of movement across the surface. The fragmented planes are unified not only through color, but also the use of short horizontal brushstrokes. The repeated horizontals and verticals, in combination with the regular brushstrokes and the angular forms, creates this dominant grid-like organization that is then challenged by the strong diagonals and curves. And so what may read initially as a very chaotic composition of lines and colors is actually a very carefully organized design. Now, neither Picasso nor Braque had any desires to be fully abstract. In fact, Picasso said there was no such thing as complete abstraction because, quote, "you have to start somewhere." So during the second phase of Cubism, which is known as synthetic Cubism, between about 1912 and 1914, the artists pulled back and they started creating works that were more suggestive of recognizable subject matter. These works maintain the idea of breaking forms down into flattened geometric planes and the use of simultaneous vision, but they often incorporate brighter colors and even simpler shapes. This period is referred to as synthetic cubism because the artists created complex compositions by combining or synthesizing the individual components. And so these individual components may or may not have their own individual meanings, but when you combine them, you're creating something entirely new. Many of the works created during this time were works of collage, which comes from the French term coller, meaning to glue. And so a collage is a work composed of separate elements that are pasted together. So in these, the individual collage elements sort of come together to create a new whole, while simultaneously signifying the presence of individual objects within the larger scene. For example, Picasso's 1912 bottle of Suze here includes an assemblage of newsprint and blue construction paper in the center that suggests a tray or a round table that's holding this elongated triangle of white paper transformed into a bottle of liquor with an actual Suze label. Around this arrangement, he's also pasted larger pieces of wallpaper representing the walls of an interior space, and newspaper clippings evoking the presence of an actual newspaper within the room. Again, he maintains the inclusion of multiple perspectives. We can see the top of the blue tray or table, the side of the glass and the bottle, and the round opening and cork of the bottle from above, all sort of simultaneously. This synthesis of elements evokes both a place and activity, enjoying a quiet drink alone while reading the newspaper, maybe in a bar or maybe at home. However, the text of the news clippings disrupts this quiet mood, as they all address the First Balkan War of 1912-1913, which contributed to the start of World War I. Perhaps Picasso here has intended to emphasize the disorder of his art by pairing it with the disorder of the world, or perhaps he meant this as a warning to his viewers to not sit idly by sipping their drinks while political threats rage. Or perhaps maybe he just simply meant this as a picture or as a collage. Similarly, we have Braque's 1912 Fruit, Dish, and Glass, which collages disparate elements, including fragments of charcoal drawings, some of which are quite naturalistic, while others are maybe more associated with analytic cubism's deconstruction of forms into angular fragments presented from multiple perspectives. Here, he's synthesized a decorative wood grain printed paper, some text, including the letters BAR and ALE, a naturalistically rendered bunch of grapes, as well as other objects that have been deconstructed into arcs, cylinders, and planes. And so again, he's evoking a place and an activity. This time, probably a bar or a cafe with this dish of fruit, some plates and glasses, as well as a menu on a tabletop. So in this work from 1912, titled Still Life with Chair Canning, Picasso continues to synthesize fragments of forms to evoke a new whole. But where Braque usually kept to papers, Picasso has also incorporated other more three-dimensional objects. He incorporates a nautical rope around the edge of the elliptical canvas to evoke the bumper of a circular table as if viewed from an angle. He also includes some canning or some sort of webbing or kind of the support that you would find in the seat and the back of a chair here to suggest that we have a chair that's been sort of scooted up to the edge of this table. To the upper right, we can kind of make out this angular, sort of rectangular form that represents the handle of a knife with this blade kind of pointing to the left here, this triangular shape. And then if you notice this sort of semicircle underneath and behind it, these are sort of representative of pieces of maybe a citrus fruit, an orange or a lemon, that the knife has been used to slice. We also have this rectangular shape that's meant to be a napkin. We have a wine glass that's built out of individualized components kind of here. And we can sort of see it from multiple perspectives simultaneously. And then we also have these letters, J-O-W, which in French means to play or a game. And so maybe he was referencing the playful, experimental nature of Cubism, but also J-O-W, these are the first three letters of the French word for newspaper. So probably these are included to represent a newspaper lying on the table. And then if you notice, we have sort of this slender, cylinder-like shape, and then it ends in kind of a fatter cylinder, and then it stretches sort of up tall like this. This is meant to be a tobacco pipe lying across the paper here. Picasso also employed his Cubist collage techniques in three-dimensional sculptures called assemblages because they are built with separate pieces, often scrap or non-traditional materials, or maybe found objects, that he then assembled in such a way that each part maintains its own identity while simultaneously contributing to the new combined whole. So on the left here we have his guitar, which was initially constructed out of paper, but this slightly later version used several pieces of scrap sheet metal that Picasso cut, bent, and then assembled. Similarly, the 1912 or 1913 mandolin and clarinet was constructed with wood scraps. And so both of these works really break from the conventional sculptural techniques of carving, modeling, or casting, and they also break from traditional sculptural subjects of human figures and instead present man-made musical instruments. Some people criticize that choice because in a lot of ways a guitar or a mandolin or a flute, in some ways these are already sort of sculptural objects, but they also have the functional application. So if Picasso wanted to create a sculpture of a musical instrument, why not just make or use an actual functional one? Well, because he wasn't truly interested in recreating the form, or the functionality for that matter. Instead, he was simply interested in the visual vocabulary of the object. Again, he's thinking about how to break things down into their most simplified essential parts, and then how to recombine those parts in a way that communicates the essence of the object. So, for example, with the guitar, we have sort of the contours of the exterior of the body, but also of the sort of interior contour. We can see both the inside and the outside simultaneously. And then Picasso has also really transformed the empty space into a material part of the sculpture. He includes the neck and the strings, which are some very recognizable parts of the guitar, but we don't have any frets and we don't have the entire form, and so, of course, it's not functional. If it was, it would be an instrument rather than a sculpture, but instead he simply evokes the essence of the instrument. The mandolin and the clarinet are even more abstract and less recognizable than the guitar. The wood scraps here show the instruments at right angles to each other, greatly simplified so that, again, we really only just have the essence of their forms.